so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I also want to thank the adjudication committee because I was the fortunate recipient of a grant that allowed me to come here, and I'm very grateful for that. So let's talk a little bit about why it is that I'm here. I'm here to talk about, well, this thing. And, well, this is a QR code that's also available down there. I have digital and physical materials. It's all the same materials, but you can see things, including the whole paper, much to my dismay, on that QR code as well. Has pretty much everything that you could, well, hope to know about this methodology. So, pitch class theory. I'm sure I say that, and a lot of us have encountered it in the undergraduate classroom. And how many people imagine their students with eye rolls, disdain, maybe a little bit of anger, maybe a couple curse words? And that's about the average experience for introducing students to pitch class theory. And it's something that vexes me, but for a lot of students, it's anxiety-inducing, it's dense, it's intimidating, and it's taught with unfamiliar repertoire. This is a lot for a student to endure in our classrooms. And these days, as we're not only seeking to reform music theory, but also the role of music in academia as a whole, we have to ask ourselves, is this the right approach if it's causing all these issues? Is there a way that we can make this better? And much of the foundational literature on post-tonal theory is primarily concerned with the internal logic of the system and its applications, and we even do have a lot of leading textbooks in the field as well, but none of them are really designed to make the transition any easier. So while this method isn't to say that there isn't good literature on the subject, it's more that the current pedagogy is perhaps a little bit under-designed. So a review of the existing literature, I don't have to spend too much time on this, but foundational texts define the theory, they're relatively dense. They're not distinctly pedagogical in nature, things like, the Alan Ford, things like that are just sort of go through, by the way, this is what it is, here's your vocabulary. And then of course you've got your post-tonal theory textbooks, things like the Strauss that a lot of people are familiar with. They're pedagogical by design, they're thorough, they've got a pretty traditional approach, but they're still pretty dense, even though they're well structured for students. Post-tonal composition textbooks, while this isn't a composition lecture, I do feel necessary to mention this, well, because I'm a composer after all. They're still dense. It's a different approach, being more about the application instead of the analysis, but they're not theory books, ultimately. And then, of course, you have the comprehensive theory textbooks, which are pedagogical by nature. They have traditional approaches, but they're not very thorough on the pitch class because it's usually like a unit at the very end, and some theory curriculums don't even touch on it in the standard core. And that's something that is hard to deal with, and as a result, you end up quickly pivoting from here's high chromaticism, here is some Debussy to cap it off, and then, by the way, that's all out the window, so here's some Schoenberg, have fun. And that's quite a pivot, that's quite the leap of logic that we're doing for our students. So, while we're researching this and sort of looking for a solution, we have the model that new knowledge is retained most effectively when connected to what the learner knows. So let's hang on to that nugget of information. So think about what it is that our students know when they reach this point in the curriculum. They probably know maybe some common practice era music, they've done perhaps some pop music analysis on their own, but most of them have never engaged with the likes of Schoenberg, Berg, etc. You've got schema theory, which is all about integrating new knowledge into existing structures. That's very important. And then, of course, you've got the ideas of scaffolded instruction, which go on about gradual movement from the known into the unknown. And so, if you look at this, the current method for introducing pitch class theory, it doesn't really line up with these leading models for learning. And that is troubling because a student, if they're encountering things in the current system, they are given, here's pitch class theory, here's this music that you may not even see as music because it's super weird, it's atonal, it's hard to follow. Oh, and by the way, you've got to learn this pretty much now because we're hitting the brakes pretty quick otherwise. And so this is This is really troubling for the average undergraduate student in my experience, thinking both as an instructor and as a student in the classroom, whereas I love math, integer notation came really easily to me, but some very brilliant people next to me that were great musicians, not necessarily as easy, because why are there numbers in my music? That just doesn't make sense to a lot of people. So we have these principles that we need connections to the previous material, we need integration into the existing structures, and we need to focus on a gradual movement from the known to the unknown. And so, using this, I was able to hypothesize that by using familiar music, we can aim to bridge the gap between familiar tonal music and atonal music, as well as its analytical tool set. And so, pitch class theory should be thought of as together with unfamiliar tonal music. Perhaps we should think of it as a bridge. Maybe it's the way that we show them the way to atonal music. Because post-tonal music is rather beautiful. In fact, a colleague of mine, Matthew Jones, he recently was going on about, some of my students, after we listened to Schoenberg a couple times, they were starting to vibe with him in our music history classroom. And I thought that was a very fascinating approach, because a lot of people see it and they immediately they hate it. It's not like anything they've ever heard. But after they've listened to it a few times, appreciate the intricacies, it's like, wait a minute, there's some really cool stuff happening here. And so I think that sort of gives me hope for this methodology. So before we go into more about, the method itself, familiar foundations, a little bit of background on my institution so you can kind of see where I was coming from. Oklahoma City University's Wanda Bass School of Music has around 300 undergraduate students up to, and the majority of which are musical theater majors, all of which are required to complete our core music theory sequence through music theory and RL Schools 1, 2, and 3. And this is followed by our reimagined fourth semester of music theory, which typically consists of 2 topics courses of their choosing. Some majors are required to complete additional topics courses such as counterpoint, but our typical offerings have ranged from pop music analysis to film music analysis, art song, and of course, music since 1900, which is where our post-tonal analysis has always lived. So the development of the method, it emerged in 2023 when I was assigned to teach music since 1900, the following spring. And my goal when thinking about this initially was thinking about pitch class theory and what made it hard for so many of my cohort whenever I was an undergrad. And I remember that, a lot of them really just didn't view what we were analyzing as music. That was really hard for them to rationalize. And on top of it, they were, like I mentioned earlier, they're trying to think of music using numbers, using pitch class sets. And this is just not normal for a lot of musicians who sit there and play their violin through their standard Beethoven or Mozart excerpts. So how do we bridge that gap? It was my hope to try and provide a more familiar starting point for my students as they begin their journey to pitch class theory. And what I ended up deciding was I should try to apply pitch class theory to a Bach chorale. We had just done a Bach chorale in my class that morning, so I was thinking about Bach. So I was like, what if I applied it to Bach? And the result is, it's not weird, but it's definitely not the way you normally analyze a Bach chorale. I mean, this is something, I think maybe a couple of us have done this as a pedagogical exercise to kind of prove that can be done, but really not a lot of people would think of Bach in this way. This is really not how we normally think of Bach. But the idea sprung from this, that perhaps this is more of an effective entry point than the traditional method of here's Schoenberg, here's how you analyze him. So the result for me was a clear and effective entry point that also has a side effect of showing off secondary sonorities in a new analytical light. I shared this developing approach with a few colleagues, several of whom enthusiastically adopted it and reported very positive results literally that month in a couple of cases. And that's what let me know that maybe I should do a little bit more research into this and perhaps turn it into a fully developed methodology. So when talking about the familiar tonal materials, what are we talking about? So the materials that our students have some degree of familiarity with. Think your common practice Bach, Mozart, Chopin maybe, Haydn, just things that you would usually think of as this is what's being performed by your college orchestra or the string quartet or being sung by a period choir, things like that. That's something that you really want to embrace. You want it to be unique for your institution because my institution differs from yours. And then the thought was, well, if we integrate pitch class theory with this familiar tonal music, what might this look like? And then, of course, how might we use this to pave the way to atonality? And what benefits might there be? That's a really fun nugget to think about. And I think you guys are going to be very pleased with the results that we end up with. So, as far as the actual instruction of it, so I've presented here a two-part lesson plan that's sort of an amalgamation of the first two iterations of this that I used it for. So, first, I present a piece of familiar tonal music, bonus that has been appeared previously in their studies or on the concert stage, etc. I introduce integer notation, define the vocabulary on pitch class theory, and then I walk them through an analysis of their common practice piece using pitch class theory. It's a little small there, but there's bigger versions on that online repository if you'd like it. And so I also use this to introduce transformational operations, and I was able to move into guided practice using the new tools, all without touching Schoenberg, Berg, or any other post-tonal composer. And that was interesting to me, even as someone who's highly interested in that music, because you can teach a lot of the nuts and bolts without having that sort of perceived barrier of, hi, this is new analysis and new music. And so on day 2, we reviewed the core concepts and questions, and we did an analysis of diatonic Roman numerals with pitch class sets via what I call the recipe book. And this recipe book is a guided activity that I had students fill in, and just, it's got your standard chords that you've seen in 8 million analyses in your lives, but finding the pitch class sets, having them reduced to normal order, and eventually prime form. And I was even able to use a version of this, I should note, in my Music Theory 3 class, as we were able to showcase enharmonic equivalence. And I even noticed some distinct benefits there as well, which I will get into at a later time. And this is, of course, a quick filled-in version that the student had. And it's a pretty straightforward assignment, and it's a great way for them to sort of make those relations to, hey, these numbers, they actually mean something. There's a harmony, there's a functionality behind it. But back to the second day of the lesson plan, you discuss the oddities within, and then at this point I did a pivot to the atonal excerpt of choice. For me, I like using the Schoenberg Opus 11. That's something that I think is a really fun one to use, mainly because, well, every textbook does it for a reason, it works. And any typical representative atonal repertoire will work, but I would recommend something that's smaller and piecemeal, because that way it still sort of eases that sort of double barrier that we were discussing at the beginning of this talk. And then, of course, analyzing using PC sets and relevant operations per usual. And this is really the shocking part, because originally I thought this was just sort of a fun way for me to get students a little bit more interested and maybe make it just a little bit better. But the initial results are super duper fun. So I actually saw an increased retention. And for me, I saw about a 50% increase in retention, but that's something that it might vary, because keep in mind this has very limited exposure at this point, and we'll talk about that later. A lot less uncertainty, including with transformations. Anyone who's taught post-tonal theory, you know that the transformations, that's, if the integer notations get them, the operations absolutely do, because they're like, why am I flipping this? Why is that clock moving? What is going on? And I found that having familiar music, it added a degree of confidence, because they were able to latch on to something that they already knew. They can see that clock face operation as, wait a minute, this is just me turning that first inversion into root position. Oh wait, I'm taking the second inversion, turning it, and so the wheels start turning. And there's a great moment in my class and Dr. Sakula's class, another colleague of mine that implemented this, where the students had an aha moment of, wait a minute, this is why all the Bach music sounds mostly the same until you get that one diminished chord in there, because major and minor have largely the same numbers involved with them. There's actually a math behind why major and minor lock in so well. And they loved that revelation. It was super astonishing to me to see students actually getting excited about aspects of post-tonal theory. And this is the best one, up to a 50% reduction in instructional time for the same materials. In one case, a buddy of mine who teaches on the East Coast, he was telling me that while he only implemented it the one time and then he had to switch to a new textbook and try that, he saw a reduction of typically 2 weeks to fully introduce post-tonal theory. He was able to do it in 1 week plus a 5-minute catch-up, that next one. For me, I love that. For me, it was something about the same. For other people, they've reported taking 3 weeks down to 2 weeks, etc. So there's a significant time savings, and particularly in today's academic environment where we're being asked to cram more and more into our syllabus, that extra week could make or break our ability to cover a new topic that we might not have been able to before, let alone possibly go more in depth for something like post-tonal theory. So the student reactions are, of course, a big part of why we do this, and they found it no longer pervades a sense of dread. This is huge because when you mention post-tonal theory, it's either that or the augmented sixth chord that makes them say, I don't want to do this anymore. And if I can remove that barrier for one of the most dreaded topics in music theory, I think that's a really big success. And of course, approaching pitch class theory with curiosity and open minds. Those revelations that, wait a minute, major and minor are more closely related than I thought. Or, wait, that's why diminished chords can actually loop onto each other infinitely. Or, that's why the augmented chord sounds funny. That's why there's only 3 of those. That's why these all sound the same. And they start to make these connections and push forward in their own studies. And in one really great case, a group of students even started inquiring about other applications of their new tools of analysis and even excitedly asking, do we get to apply this to Schoenberg next? And that is something that I think is astonishing. So we managed to take a dreaded moment in music theory and turn it into a, wait a minute, when do we get to apply this for real? And that is astonishing, not only because, well, we managed to do that for this one topic, but in today's academic environment, to get the students truly excited about anything, that's gotta be a victory, right? And there have been other implications, or not implications, other implementations of this, but I'm not gonna go into details on the 4 or 5 I have the full report on, but I will tell you a little bit about Dr. Sakula's because I think it was rather novel. She mostly did the same thing that I did, roughly that same lesson plan that I showed you and that you have some version of. But her big thing was, instead of introducing the Bach straight up, she had a 10-minute exercise where the students were space aliens, and they had to try and make sense of the dots and lines on the pages. And they were able to, on their own, figure out, wait a minute, numbers, 1 through 12. And then she had to make a little course correction and say, hey, 0's important, let's include that. And then beyond that, it was much the same fare, and the students had the same levels of success. So we're able to teach the material more effectively on a little bit less time and have students more excited. So this has a lot of implications for me off of this, well, relatively new methodology. So beginning with familiar tonal music reduces cognitive load. Also acts as a removal of unnecessary barriers to understanding. Because knowledge barriers are huge, because whether or not they're real, the students perceive them as real. If they think that they won't get it because I'm bad at math, there's 7s and 8s in my music analysis now, I can't do it anymore. If you can remove that barrier or remove the barrier of, hey, this is weird post-tonal, they can just focus on one problem at a time. And this falls into our learning models as well of trying to introduce things in familiar contexts and of course, building on what they already know instead of doing a hard pivot with basically no transition. The recipe book activity anchors pitch class operations in the note. This is super important for me because nothing matters more than a student being able to apply what we do in the classroom in a new context, whether it be a full analysis or an isolated incident. Of course, the recipe book is a series of isolated incidents, but I think it's really important that they're able to do that. And that's why them doing it as sort of a fill in the blanks on their own, and then we check it in class, super important for me. And feel free to use that recipe book. A few other people are using it now too. Feel free to use it. The brief exposure to atonal concepts before full atonal pivot could reduce the overwhelm factor. And this is something that is a bit more hypothetical. I haven't fully tested this yet, but I have a feeling that we can continue to remove that barrier as well by just dropping nuggets of atonal into their music as they get through theory 1, 2, and 3. And then, of course, pitch class theory need not appear as this unseen leviathan in the classroom. It can instead act as an extension of, or even a complement of, tonal analysis, such as with my enharmonic equivalents. And then, of course, the familiar to unfamiliar pathway may benefit other advanced theory topics. So what's next? Well, familiar music will vary by institution. Those who adopt this method should adapt it for their students. Don't steal my exact repertoire list, though. If you want to use it, feel free. But if you can use something from your classroom that means a lot to your students, please do. That'll make it that much more familiar. And so also investigating further applications of the concepts of this methodology can act as an extension for other theory work, of course, and harmonic equivalencies. Brief preparatory encounters should be investigated, and already touched upon by some whenever they discuss intervals using half steps. This is something that I've put in here, but then I realized that not everyone does this anymore. So what I'm referencing here is whenever we're talking about the beginnings of here's the second, here's the third, having students count out, okay, here's the amount of semitones. That is a small little touch in the lake, so to speak, for eventual integer notation, at least the way that I see it. So this really is something that we've been doing for years, just we haven't really said that we're doing it yet. Further inquiries should follow the same familiar and unfamiliar pathway, and I think there's a lot of hope for this now that this method has kind of been introduced in a few places and seems to be successful. But perhaps the biggest thing, I'd like to do a larger comparative study on the impacts, because this is from a handful of institutions, a handful of instructors, and really the more data I can get would be amazing. So I would love to get data from 10, 20 institutions, get it from 10, 20 instructors, and I'd like institutions of all sizes to be able to do this. And one other thing to keep in mind is this hasn't been applied yet, but I do believe that it could be useful for, say, a graduate review type thing, but I don't think it should be used as a graduate introduction to the concept. So depending on where your school lies on that spectrum of whether that's part of review or part of their coursework, that would determine whether or not it is useful in that context. It has not been implemented in a graduate classroom, to my knowledge, as of giving this talk. So this is the, well, for lack of better terms, this is the bibliography, if you are interested in it, but there's a hard copy version, there's also versions digitally. But now I will take your questions, because really this method is just beginning, and while pitch class theory remains an essential part of any music program, it is important that it not be introduced in its most intimidating form. The familiar foundations approach argues that pedagogical sequence in which the students first encounter pitch class excerpts through tonal materials they know allows them to connect new analytical tools to establish musical understanding. The evidence presented here has suggested to me, at least, that this approach can improve retention, strengthen student confidence, reduce the amount of time required to move into post-tonal analysis without weakening the rigor of material. More broadly, it reflects a simple but important pedagogical principle. Students learn difficult ideas more meaningfully when instruction is rooted in what is already familiar. Familiar foundations is no longer just a strategy for teaching pitch class theory, but also perhaps a model for how music theory pedagogy might continue to evolve in response to the needs of the 21st century student. I thank you for attending my talk.